Today on Faith Church with Pastor Thorpe.
Some of you have a file cabinet at your house. You ought to have one in your heart. Dr. Tim Glenn, who pastors in Fort Worth, says that all of us ought to have a faith file. Something to remind us of every battle we've already done with the devil and how victoriously we came out on the other side. And you do know that the higher the level you get on, the worse the devil is you got to face. The more God blesses you, the higher he elevates you, the more stuff you're going to have to deal with. I don't know why you tripping so hard that you're going through now. You're no longer in kindergarten. One of the worst things that people can ever do is to take us or our situations for granted. I'm Pastor Kevin Thorpe, Senior Pastor of the Faith Church. Let's spend some time together learning about what life looks like when the devil keeps forgetting that this is not our first battle, this is not our first victory. Let's listen together. Of all the books of the Bible, and I love all of them, all 66 of them, but there is a special place in my heart for the Acts of the Apostles. I love this book of the Bible, this fifth book in the New Testament. There's several things contained in the book of Acts that are of supreme importance. The first is found in Acts chapter 1 and in Acts chapter 2. It is this: the birth of the church is recorded. That's what you find in chapter 1 and chapter 2, that when the church got started, some 3,000 souls came to Christ all at the same time. And you find that in chapter 1 and in chapter 2 of the book of Acts. The birth of the church is recorded. But then in chapter 3, you discover that the influence of the church is magnified. Church is born in chapter 2. Their influence is magnified in chapter 3. That is, after the church got started, God began using them mightily. So when you get to chapter 3, there was a man who had laid lame at a gate, and two of the apostles, Peter and John, came along and brought deliverance to the man. That occurs in chapter 3. So the birth of the church is recorded in 1 and 2, but then the influence of the church is magnified in chapter 3. Then when you get to chapters 4 and chapter 5, you discover that the persecution of the church was intensified. They start in chapter 2, begin growing in chapter 3. By the time you get to chapters 4 and 5, persecution intensified, which causes me to tell you that whenever God is blessing, you can expect the devil to start messing. Some of you need to stick a pin in the notion that whenever you get a new car, whenever you get a new house, whenever you get a new man, whenever you get a new woman, you can expect the devil to show up sooner rather than later. Chapter 1 and 2, church is born. Chapter 3, they're able to grow in their influence. By the time you get to chapter 4 and in chapter 5, persecution of the church becomes greatly intensified. By the time you get to verse 33 of Acts chapter 5, a number of significant things have already occurred. When a man is healed in chapter 3, the influence causes thousands of souls to come into the kingdom. The enemies of Christ became upset with the apostles, and they actually throw them in prison. They stay in prison overnight. And when they are released in chapter 4, their enemies say to them, you should never again teach or preach in the name of Jesus Christ. What they do, Sister Tiny, after being arrested and released, they went back to the church and had a prayer meeting. And the same power that God had given them in chapter 3 to heal and deliver, he pours that power out on them again in chapter 4, and they are empowered all over again. By the time you arrive in the early verses of chapter 5, a problem spread in the church where a man had taken some gifts and took land, sold the land, took the money, offered it as a gift to the kingdom of God. A couple by the name of Ananias and Sapphira, when they saw that the church rejoiced in the land gift that the man had given, they decided that they wanted the same level of rejoicing. The Bible says they sold some land, and instead of giving all of the money, they held some of the money back for themselves. But then, Sister Pat, they lied and said that they were giving all of the money. It's bad to lie. It's worse to lie in church. And according to the early verses of chapter 5, Sister Desi, when they lied in church, they lied and they died. The Bible says that when they died, Sister Demetrius, that great fear spread in the church. I bet it did. Can you imagine that if you walked in here today and anything you did wrong, you died for it? Wouldn't be many of us still in here. We'd have to have Mr. Duncan and Mr. Chestnut on speed dial if you died whenever you did that which was wrong. And when great fear spread throughout the church, God magnified their influence even the more. And he used them until thousands of additional souls came to the kingdom. The enemies of Christ became upset that God was using them mightily, and they arrest them all over again. And by the time you get to verse 33, those who have arrested them have decided to kill them. But it was then that one in the crowd, when you get to verse 34, you discover his name was Gamaliel. He was skilled in Old Testament law and tradition. Gamaliel reminded them. Gamaliel said, before we kill these men, let's remember some stuff. Gamaliel says that there was another man named Theudas who was able to get other people to follow him, even 400 of them. But because Theudas was not the real thing, he was destroyed, and those who followed him left also. You then read that Gamaliel says to them, not only Theudas, but there was another man named Judas of Galilee, who also had people to follow him. But when he went away, they went away also. What Gamaliel was driving home was, Gamaliel was reminding them that these men that you all are thinking about killing, If they're doing these miracles in their own strength, it won't last long. But if they're doing these miracles in the name of the Lord, you better leave them alone, because you'll find yourself fighting against God, and that's a battle you just can't win. Thorpe, what does that mean to us in this room today? What it means is, Sister Mangum, instead of us always going to God to tell him how bad the devil is, you need to learn how to go to the devil and tell him how bad your God is. It is obvious that when the devil takes on some of us, we got to learn how to develop a Beyonce spirit. Beyonce told some dude, she never told us what his name was, but Beyonce, does that sound too urban? Told some dude. Beyonce mentioned to a fellow, Beyonce say, you must not. I just want to see how some of y'all been in. I want to see if y'all was going to go there. They say, you must not know about me. Which means she was saying, you should have checked my record and checked my history before you tried me. And I contend that when the devil does battle with some of us, it's some stuff he obviously must have forgotten. He needs to check the record and discover that this fight is not going to end the way he thinks it is. In verse 33, the enemy decides to kill Jesus' followers. By the time you get to the end of the chapter, those who were under the threat of death will find themselves rejoicing. I want to teach you today how to do the same. How to move from the verse 33 in your life to the verse 41 and 42 of your life. In verse 33, they were under the threat of death. By the time you get to 41 and 42, they found themselves rejoicing. It all occurred after the devil was forced to remember some stuff. Here's the first thing I want to recommend that you learn how to tell the devil. You ought to be able, first of all, to look him right in his ugly, nasty, slew-footed face and tell him, first of all, devil, this is not my first time here. Which means, say, that's short for Satan. This is not my first battle. This is not the first time I've been in trouble. This is not the first time I've been sick. This is not the first time I've been without a job. This is not the first time I've been in relationship trouble. This is not the first time my children have found themselves in peril. And you ought to remind the devil, if you were going to kill me, you should have caught me before now. Because now that I've been through some stuff, you can't trick me like you used to. Anybody in here willing to testify that there's some stuff that people tried on you in the 80s they can't try on you this week? There's some things you went through years ago and you've promised God and 2 or 3 more responsible people you ain't never going, okay, never going that way again. And what you find in the text in chapter 4, when we get to chapter 5, they are arrested, but they had already been arrested in chapter 4. You find it when you read verse 1 through verse 4, then 5 through 10, then 15 through 21. They were arrested, held overnight, and when they were released, they were commanded never again to preach or teach in the name of Jesus Christ. And you know what they did? They went right back to doing what had gotten them in trouble in the first place. So that when they got arrested in chapter 5, their conclusion was, devil, this ain't nothing new. I've been here before. And why is it that often when we go through something the second, third, or fourth time, we behave like we so brand new. Somebody in this room, you lost your job, and your family thinks you're going to lose everything because you're behaving so frantically. When the truth is, the only reason you got that job is because they fired you off the one you was on for that. Which means, why trip now if this ain't the first time you've been here? And sometimes you need to allow some boldness to rise up in you before you start inviting people to your pity party. Shut the party down and say, devil, I've been here before. And you can't break me in June of 2015 because of some stuff I went through in June of 2014. Wish I had somebody who knew what I was talking about. And you ought to be able to tell that devil right in his face. And some of you ain't got to look far to find him. As soon as you get to work tomorrow morning, they'll be waiting on you. Some other folks, you when you get back home, you can walk right across the street. And they're the devil. Some of you don't even have to leave your house. You can walk out of one room, walk into another. They're the devil. Some ain't got to go that far. You can roll over. Stare the devil right in the face. And some don't have to go that far. Go to the bathroom, look in the mirror. There's a little bit of say in us. But you got to tell him, devil, this is not my first time here. That's the first thing you ought to be able to tell him. Here's the second one. You ought to be able to look say, short for Satan, right in his ugly face, and not only tell him, this is not my first time here. You ought to be able to look the devil in his face and tell him, devil, this is not your first time here. Which means, devil, this ain't first time me and you went at it. And you need to remember how it turned out the last time. The definition of insanity is when you continue to do the same thing expecting a different outcome. When you keep doing what you've been doing, expecting it to turn out differently. Well, you're not going to like much of this. If you keep coming home with clowns, quit hanging out where clowns are. I shared with you before. If you keep coming home with crawfish and tadpoles, quit fishing in the ditch. Because if you ever want a blue marlin, you got to go deep sea fishing. If you want somebody that got a cell phone and a house phone and they don't mind if you answer either one of them, that's a deep water fish. Now, if you want somebody that every time the phone rings, they got to go in another room, you catch that in the ditch. And if ditch folk are what you want, keep hanging out in ditches. But if you ever want people that you can trust and depend on, you got to change your behavior. And what the devil needs to remember when he attacks some of us is how it turned out the last time he tried us. My mom's name is Eloise. My dad's name is Slater. I lived in their house for the first 20 years of my life. There's some things I didn't try more than one time. For example, my dad would often work on the night shift and perform, and that meant that he had to sleep during the day. And when my dad said to my brother Alex and me to be quiet so he could sleep, one time we act like we didn't quite understand that. And he came into our room like Rambo. And by the time he left the room, so shepherd, we had new attitudes. And I'm 41. I'm scared to wake him up now. And you ought to be able to tell the devil, not only is it true that this is not my first time here, but devil, this is not your first time here either. You tried me before, and I put you in your place. Because what occurs in the text, when you read verse 34 through verse 39, Gamaliel says, listen, we already arrested these folks in chapter 4, and they went back to preaching. When you get in chapter 5, they arrest them the second time. And Brother Doug, they were planning to kill them. And Gamaliel stands up and says, when you read it in verse 34, then stood there up one in the council of Pharisee, that was a religious elite in their day, named Gamaliel, a doctor of the law, had in reputation among all the people. That means he was well known and highly respected. And he commanded to put the apostles forth a little space. What he said was they brought them to themselves. I'll show you in a moment how they got out of jail. They bring the apostles to them. And Gamaliel starts remembering some stuff. And Gamaliel says, put them boys over there and let's talk a minute before we put our hands on them. And Gamaliel says in verse 35, he said unto them, ye men of Israel, take heed to yourselves what ye intend to do as touching these men. He said, now, before we bother these fellows, let's remember some stuff that we have obviously forgotten. Verse 36, he says, before these days rose up Theudas, boasting himself to be somebody, to whom a number of men, about 400, joined themselves, who were slain, and all as many as obeyed him were scattered and brought to naught or brought to nothing. After this man rose up Judas of Galilee in the days of the taxing. He too drew away much people after him. He also perished, and all, even as many as obeyed him, were dispersed. And now I say unto you, refrain from these men, leave them alone. For if this counsel or this work be of men, it will come to naught. What the devil was saying, what Gamaliel represents on the devil's behalf is, if this is not real, it won't last anyway. Verse 39, but if it be of God, you cannot overthrow it, lest haply ye be found even to fight against God. What I find to be interesting, Minister Kip, is that the text says that when Theudas tried to behave as though he was the Savior, 400 people followed him. But what's interesting about that is we're in Acts chapter 5. In Acts chapter 2, 3,000 souls followed Christ. And by the time you get to Acts chapter 4, another 5,000 souls followed Christ. What Gamaliel is saying is all fights are not the same. Several times over recent years, I have had, and matter of fact, I was going to show you one this morning, but I didn't want to scare some of you with violence. I wasn't going to be violent. I was going to show you a boxing match from 1927. Some of us ain't never come back to this church. Preach a swing on it. It's not what I'm getting at. But several times over the years, I have watched people take on opponents that they thought they could handle, only to discover that things are not always what they appear. For example, Samson, who was a leader in God's army, his enemy wanted to know where his strength came from. Samson had been so powerful throughout his life until he was able to slay thousands of men with the jawbone of a donkey. That's a bad dude who'll kill you with a bone. Don't bother nobody, Sister Kirkland, who can kill you with a bone. Now, what I find to be interesting, and it was Bishop T.D. Jakes who helped me to understand this, he said that it was obvious that Samson didn't look like much from the outside. Because Clarence, if he had looked like a lot from the outside, nobody would have questioned where his strength came from. You would have saw it when you looked at it. He didn't look like much, but he wasn't nothing to mess with. And what Samson's enemies needed to be reminded of is even though somebody doesn't look like much from the outside, it ain't always the size of the dog that's in the fight. Sometimes it's about the size of the fight that's in the dog. For example, I've run into some mamas who wasn't much over 4 or 5 feet tall till you bothered their kids. And a kitty cat turns into a lion when you bother their kids. Somebody else says you're kind and docile till somebody bother your money. When they start messing with your money, you show out for real. I shared with you recently in 1927, Gene Tooney, spelled Tunney, faced Jack Dempsey for the heavyweight title in boxing. And Tooney was hit by Dempsey with a number of combinations, and Tooney went down. There is a rule in boxing that whenever you are knocked down, it is the referee's job to determine whether or not you're able to continue the fight. The method they use is what they call a 10 count. You get knocked down, the referee comes over to where you are, and they pound on the mat until they reach the number 10. And if you're still in a position where you can't defend yourself at the end of the 10 count, you considered knocked out. In that heavyweight fight in 1927, Dempsey knocks Tooney down, but he forgot a very important rule in boxing. And that rule is, Brother Al, whenever you knock your opponent down, you have to find a neutral corner in the ring while the 10 count goes on. And what Dempsey did was to go to the wrong corner. And instead of the referee counting Tooney out, it took him an extra, as some speculate, 3 to 5 seconds to get Dempsey in the right corner before he could start to count. And it took him so long to get the count started until Tooney was able to revive himself and ended up winning the fight on points. Because Dempsey forgot which corner to go to. And that's how the devil is. You need to always recognize that even though the devil has some power, he doesn't have all power. You can beat him. And you can beat him every time. You ought to remind him what happened in 2013 when he tried you. You put him in his place. You ought to remind him what happened in 2014. You put him in his place. So that when you face him in 2015, he ought to remember what he's already been through the last times he faced you. And it ain't because you so big and bad in and of yourself. It's all about who you're rolling with. I wish I had somebody who knew what I was talking about. In Hebrews chapter 11, you have what is called the roll call of faith. You have a list of Old Testament characters, watch this, who knew what it was to trust God even when they couldn't trace God. These are people who obeyed God when their circumstances dictated otherwise. You read about Abraham. You read about Sarah. You read about Isaac and Jacob. You read about Enoch. All those who trusted God in spite of the circumstances that they faced. That's in Hebrews chapter 11. That's history. Then you get to Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1. And the Hebrew writer says, and I'll paraphrase it, King James Version says, wherefore seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us. What's interesting about that, Sister Brittany, is that the witnesses that we are surrounded by are mentioned in the history in chapter 11. Chapter 12 tells us what to do with the history that's already been established. Here's my recommendation. Some of you have a file cabinet at your house. You ought to have one in your heart. Dr. Tim Glenn, who pastors in Fort Worth, says that all of us ought to have a faith file. Something to remind us of every battle we've already done with the devil and how victoriously we came out on the other side. And you do know that the higher the level you get on, the worse the devil is you got to face. The more God blesses you, the higher he elevates you, the more stuff you're going to have to deal with. I don't know why you tripping so hard that you're going through now. You no longer in kindergarten. You're at least in the 7th grade. There ought to be some PhD candidates in here who've been through so much stuff early on until now is certain things you just ain't going to put up with. That's how I am. Some battles I just ain't going to fight. Been through that before. Ain't going that way again. So Hebrews chapter 12 verse 1 says that because of the victories that others have already won over the devil, when the devil comes to you, he ought to see the God that's in you and recognize how that thing is going to turn out before the fight ever gets started. Some people you just need to leave alone. And you ought to be able to look that devil right in his ugly, twisted, slew-footed, stank face. And tell him, devil, this is not my first time here. This is not your first time here. But that's not all. There's a third element in the text that you ought to be able to say to the devil whenever you meet him head on. It's found in chapter 5, verse 17 through verse 32. And it is this. You ought to be able to tell the devil, devil, say, slewfoot, stank face. My decisions are based on my convictions. What I love about these men, by the time you get to Acts chapter 5 and verse 17, they had developed convictions. A conviction is that which dwells within you that does not change based on the circumstances you find yourself in. See, convictions are not situational. Some of us, not none of y'all in here, some of your cousins, they act differently based on the crowd they get around. You ever watch folk like that? When they're around certain folk, what to do, cuz? How about it, player? What's up? You about their life? Then they get another environment. How do you do, sir? How do you do? Just go and be real. You ought to have a sense of conviction that says to you, right is right and wrong is wrong. And by the time you get to verse 17, these men are arrested for the second time. They were arrested in chapter 4, kept in jail overnight. When they were released, they had a prayer meeting, and the same power that God had given them in chapter 2 and in chapter 3, he gave it to them all over again in chapter 4. When you get to chapter 5, beginning in verse 17, the same men are arrested again, and God shows up and miraculously delivers them from prison. Their enemies go to the jail to get them, only to discover the doors are still locked, the guards are still standing on the outside, but the prisoners are no longer inside. While they are standing there, someone walks up to them and says, the men that you're looking for are back where you arrested them. They're in the temple teaching and preaching about Jesus Christ. When they get to them, they say to them, didn't we tell you to no longer preach in his name? To which they responded, it is better for us to obey God than to obey men. You know what that is? Conviction. Conviction. And the devil needs to recognize that the reason he can't change you by changing your circumstances is because who you are is not based on your circumstances. And you're on dangerous ground if your stuff changes and you change too. You're on dangerous ground when the people around you can change their attitudes and it changes your attitude. You need to be careful about some of the company you keep. Because when you get to the place where you start being low down and cutthroat because other people are low down and cutthroat, you've been around them too long. Somebody in this room, you don't cuss till you get around other folks who do. You don't drink till you get around other folks who do. You don't fire one up. You don't burn up a tree. You don't roll none till you get around somebody else who rolling one. Why? Lack of conviction. See, when you got convictions, it doesn't matter what's happening around you. It doesn't change who you are. You won't stoop. You won't bend. You won't bow. Because all of your decisions are based on conviction. Well, you ought to be able to look say right in the face and tell him, devil, this is not my first time here. You ought to be able to look say right in the face. Devil, this is not your first time here. You fought me last week, and I put you on your behind. And you ought to tell him, devil, my decisions are based on my convictions. But then the last thing, and you're not going to like this, because I didn't like it when I read it in the text. Fourth thing you ought to be able to tell the devil is, devil, you might slow me down, but you can't stop me. Now, I got to be honest with you. I love the Bible, but I don't like it all the time. And when you get verse 38 through verse 40, so Sabrina, you read some troubling words. Gamaliel says in verse 38, and again, he's talking to the Cold Water Committee who have already planned to kill these men in verse 33. Gamaliel says in verse 38, he said, I say unto you, refrain from these men, let them alone. Don't kill them. For if this counsel or this work be of men, it will come to naught or to nothing. But if it be of God, Ye cannot overthrow it, lest haply ye be found even to fight against God. Now, here's what's amazing about that. It's in verse 33 where they wanted to kill these men. And in verse 38 through verse 39, Gamaliel has convinced them to leave these men alone and not to kill them. But then you read verse 40. And to him they agreed. That means they agreed with what Gamaliel says. They did not kill them. And when they had called the apostles and beaten them, and that's the part I don't like. In verse 33, they decide to kill them. In verse 38 and verse 39, they decide not to kill them. But in verse 40, they beat them. Now, in chapter 4 of Acts, these men were arrested, stayed overnight, and when they got out, they had a prayer meeting. In chapter 5, these men were arrested. God shows up, miraculously delivers them from prison, then sends them back to the temple to preach all over again, which is what got them arrested in chapter 4 and in chapter 5. And the same God who delivered them in the early verses of chapter 5 stood by and let them get beaten by the time you get to verse 40. And they commanded that they should not speak in the name of Jesus and let them go. Don't read verse 40 so fast until you miss the fact that before they got let go, they got beat. Now, by the time you get to verse 41 and verse 42, verse 41 says that these same men who were beaten in verse 40 left there rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer shame for the Lord's name. And then in verse 42, daily in the temple and in every house, they ceased not to teach and preach Jesus Christ. The same thing that got them arrested, the same thing that got them imprisoned, the same thing that got them beaten is what they went back to doing. Watch the scene. Verse 33, they're under the threat of death. By the time you get to verse 39, Gamaliel says, don't touch them. By the time you get to verse 40, they're beaten. By the time you get to verse 41 and verse 42, they leave rejoicing and go back to doing what got them in trouble in the first place. Let's go over it again. In verse 33, they're under the threat of death. In verse 39, God shows up on their behalf so that they are not put to death. Verse 40, they're beaten. Verse 41 and verse 42, they're delivered and they leave rejoicing. My question to you is, what verse are you in? Some of us are in the verse 33 of our lives. The enemy is attacking us as if we've been picked out to be picked on. Others of us are in the verse 39 of our lives. The enemy set out to attack us, but the Lord showed up and showed himself strong to deliver us. But then there's some others who are in our verse 40, where even though you've been delivered, you're still going through some stuff. And there's some others who are in the 41 and 42. We're rejoicing and getting back into the same trouble that got us in trouble in the first place. For the Lord's sake and not for our own. And what I want to challenge you to do is to recognize that for every verse 33, there will be a 39. For every 39, there will be a 40. But if you hang in there, God will give you a 41 and a 42. And what I don't want you to do is to quit in your 33, get comfortable in your 39, and give up when the beating starts in verse 40. I want you to recognize that these men were just as saved in verse 40 as they were in verse 39. God is delivering them in 39, and they are beaten by the time you get to 40. They're just as spiritual in 40 as they were in 39. Brother Howard, you say, well, Thorpe, what does that mean to us? I want you to recognize that there's some stuff, child of God, that you're going to go through. All of your days, boo, are not going to be sunshiny days. It's some stuff you got to go through. Your heart is going to break. You're going to beg God one day to keep a loved one alive, and God is going to let that loved one die. We all got to die one day. Can you think of what it would be like if we never died? Some of us so mean we don't need to stay here forever. A man took his wife on a trip to the Holy Land. They went to Jerusalem, the home of Jesus and the apostles. And while he was over there, his wife died. And local authorities came to him and said, sir, we're sorry for your loss, but we would like to offer you something that few people are rarely able to take advantage of. So we can either take your wife's remains and have her shipped back to the U.S. in your home state of Florida, or we can bury your wife right here in the Holy Land where Jesus walked, without even taking a breath. The man said, put my wife on a plane and send her back to Florida. They say, you don't want to bury her in the Holy Land. He said, the last fella I heard about that y'all buried only stayed dead for 3 days and came back, and I can't take that chance. Send her back to Florida. I done had all that I can take. Your life is going to have some dark days. And some of us, the devil has convinced you that because you have slowed down that the race is over. No, you're not going to be sprinting all the time. This is a long distance race, not a 100-yard dash. And you're going to get tripped up some along the way. Get over it. Recognize that life has some down times in it, but you're better than whatever you find yourself in. You can be beaten in 40 and get back up in 41 and 42. Don't let the devil convince you that the fact that he has delayed you means he can deny you. You say, Pastor, I went back to school, but I couldn't stay. That don't mean you can't go back. You say, Pastor, I was in a relationship, it didn't work out. That doesn't mean that God won't give you another one. You say, Pastor, I had a car and they repoed it. That doesn't mean that God can't fix things and give you another chance. All over his word, you read about people who had some bad days, but God came and turned it around. He can slow you down, but he can't stop you. He beat them in 40. They were back preaching in 41 and 42. What verse are you in? Because somebody's on the verge of letting it all go. And I'm tired of all this. Tired of trying. Tired of doing the right thing. I'm going back on the corner. I'm going to slang some. And what the Lord's trying to tell you is, I didn't bring you this far to leave you now. I didn't bring you to the place that you'd have to go back to the garbage and the filth that I delivered you out of. You're going through a rough patch, but that ain't the end. You can be in verse 40, but hold on to 40. Because you're on your way to 41 and 42. And all the people say. Well, we've come to the end of today's telecast. I certainly pray that you've enjoyed this time that we have spent together. We greatly look forward to seeing you in person, but until then, you be blessed.
To order a copy of today's message on either CD or DVD, call us at 352-375-4850. You can also visit us on the World Wide Web at www.faithinfo.com. That's www.faithinfo.com. All major credit cards accepted. Pastor would love to meet you in person.